Have you ever been the kind of person who knew very clearly that you shouldn't make a decision while you were angry, but then still said something, and a few hours later, or a few days later, wished you had just stayed quiet a little longer? Or a more familiar situation. You see an item. Maybe it's a new phone, a pair of shoes, a piece of tech. And in that moment, the feeling in your head is very clear. I need this. I deserve this. Just buy it. It'll be fine. The decision gets made very quickly. But a few days later, when you look back at the receipt, or when the first emotional rush has faded, your brain starts switching into a different mode. I didn't actually need it that much. Why did I decide so fast back then? I wish I had waited one more day. I've been there too. There was a time I argued with a friend. At that moment, I was completely sure I was right. The feeling inside me was strong. Like there was a surge of energy pushing me to react right away. To respond. To defend my point of view. To prove that I was right. And I did. But later that night, when everything was quiet again, my brain started replaying the conversation. And I realized something a little uncomfortable. The truth was, I wasn't thinking entirely with reason in that moment. I was reacting with emotion. The funny thing is, we usually think of ourselves as rational decision makers. We like to believe, before I do anything, I think it through carefully. But if you look back honestly, a lot of the decisions in our lives actually happen in the opposite order. Emotion comes first. Reason comes later. Emotion steps on the gas. Reason shows up afterward to write the report explaining why the car was already moving. You decide first. And then, your brain starts searching for reasons to justify that decision. This isn't just about you. It's not because you lack discipline. And it's not because you're weak. Actually, this is how the human brain was designed from the beginning. Millions of years of evolution built a system inside us, where emotion is often much faster than reason. So fast that, many times, you've already made the decision before the rational part of your brain has even fully woken up. And the interesting part is, your brain doesn't see this as a flaw. In fact, for most of human evolutionary history, this was a major survival advantage. But in the modern world, the same mechanism that once helped our ancestors survive in the wild can now make us buy the wrong thing, say the wrong thing, believe the wrong thing, love the wrong person, or make decisions that we end up paying for over a long time. So the real question is, what is actually happening inside our heads when emotion keeps running ahead of reason? To understand why we so often make emotional decisions before rational ones, we have to look at how the brain is put together. One slightly surprising thing is this. Our rational brain is actually the newer part in evolutionary history. If you imagine the brain as a large company, there are two departments operating at the same time. One is the fast reacting department. The other is the slow analyzing department. And those two departments do not run at the same speed. The fast reacting department, the emotional system. Inside the brain, there's a small region called the amygdala. It sits deep in the brain, and it works a lot like a survival alarm bell. Its job is very simple. To quickly detect things related to danger, reward, desire, threat, or opportunity. What matters here is this. The amygdala does not need a long time to think. It can react in milliseconds. When you see an angry face, when someone says something that hits your pride, when you spot something incredibly tempting, the amygdala can trigger an emotional response almost instantly. At that point, a whole series of chemicals in the brain starts shifting. Dopamine, linked to reward and desire. Adrenaline helps trigger fast reactions. Cortisol rises when there's stress or a sense of threat. You haven't even had time to think yet, but your body is already preparing to respond. The slow analyzing department, the prefrontal cortex. The rational side of us mainly lives in the prefrontal cortex. This is the area responsible for things like logical analysis, weighing consequences, long-term planning, behavioral control. Put simply, this is the brain's executive director. But there's one small problem. This part is much slower. It needs time to compare information, evaluate risk, and predict consequences. Meanwhile, the emotional system has often already made a preliminary decision. The brain is like a car. There's an image I really like for explaining this. Imagine the brain as a car. Emotion is the gas pedal. It reacts incredibly fast. A small trigger, and the car surges forward. Reason is the steering wheel and the brakes. It helps you adjust direction. It helps you slow down. It helps you avoid crashing. But if the gas pedal gets slammed first, the steering and brakes usually have to catch up afterward. That's why so many decisions in life happen in this order. Keycap 1 emotion gets activated. Keycap 2 behavior happens. Keycap 3 reason shows up to explain it. A truth that many people don't notice. What's fascinating is that, in many neuroscience studies, researchers have found that the brain often starts making a decision before we become consciously aware of it. In other words, the brain has already leaned toward one option before you can even say in your head, "Let me think about it." Reason often acts more like a spokesperson. It is not always the one making the decision. Sometimes it arrives afterward, to write a reasonable explanation for an emotional decision that was already made. And this leads to something very familiar in everyday life. We don't just make decisions based on emotion. We're also incredibly good at rationalizing those decisions afterward. But this mechanism is not entirely bad. Actually, it once helped our ancestors survive in extremely dangerous situations. The problem only appears when an ancient survival mechanism gets dropped into a modern world, full of advertising, social media, social pressure, and complex choices. And in that world, fast emotion can make us pace slowly. If you pay close attention, you'll start to notice a pattern that repeats itself all the time in life. In the moment itself, emotional decisions often feel very right, very certain, very reasonable. Sometimes it even feels like this is exactly what you should do immediately. But a few hours later, or a few days later, the brain starts reviewing the whole situation from a different angle. And then the familiar sentence appears. "I should have waited a little longer." What's interesting is this. When you were making the decision, your brain did not feel like it was wrong. In fact, it often feels extremely right. Why does it feel so right in that moment? Going back to the mechanism we talked about earlier. When the amygdala and the brain's reward system get activated, dopamine starts to rise. Dopamine doesn't just create a feeling of pleasure. It creates something even more important. A sense of certainty. When dopamine rises, the brain sends signals that feel something like, "This is a good choice. Go in this direction. Don't hesitate." So in that moment, you don't just want to do something. You also believe it makes sense. But here's the problem. Emotion tends to think short term. The brain's emotional system is mainly designed to deal with immediate danger, immediate reward, immediate reaction. It is not very good at evaluating things like consequences 6 months from now, long-term impact, accumulated risk. That is the job of the prefrontal cortex. But as we said earlier, that part operates more slowly. So a very common pattern happens. In the first moment, emotion drives the decision. Then a few hours or a few days later, reason starts analyzing. And that's when you get that feeling of, wait, why didn't I think of that at the time? The truth is, it's not that you couldn't think of it. It's that the emotional system had already made the decision first. A very everyday example. Think about arguments. When someone says something that bothers you, the amygdala gets activated. Emotion rises. Your heart rate goes up. Your body tenses. At that point, you're not trying to understand the other person. You want to hit back. You want to say something back. And the feeling in your mind is very clear. If I don't respond right now, I'm weak. But a few hours later, when cortisol and adrenaline have gone down, the brain starts processing the conversation again. That's when you see it differently. Maybe I overreacted. And what's interesting is this. You are not two different people. It's just that two different systems in the brain were active at two different times. The long-term consequences. If this mechanism keeps repeating too often, it can affect financial decisions, relationships, health, work. Not because we aren't intelligent, but because the brain was not designed for the modern world. It was designed for an environment where fast reactions helped you avoid danger. Rewards usually came immediately. Choices were not overly complex. In the modern world, we have to make decisions about money, love, career, and long-term health. These things require slowing down. But the brain's emotional system is still operating with the logic of a hunter-gatherer world. And that's why many people end up thinking. So the goal must be to remove emotion from decision-making. But actually, that turns out to be a pretty big misunderstanding. After understanding this mechanism, many people come to a very common conclusion. So if I want to make good decisions, I need to eliminate emotion. That sounds reasonable. But in reality, it's more complicated than that. Because if you truly remove emotion from decision-making, you run into a different kind of problem. A fascinating discovery in neuroscience. There were patients who had damage in the connections between the emotional system and the prefrontal cortex. What was surprising is this. These people still had normal IQs. They could do math. They could analyze logically. They could understand right and wrong in theory. But they had a very strange problem. They could barely make decisions. Even with simple things like choosing what to eat, choosing what to wear, organizing their schedule. They could spend hours analyzing and still not choose. Why? Because emotion doesn't just make us impulsive. Emotion also acts like a value marking system. It helps the brain answer the question, what matters more? Emotion is like color on a map. Imagine you're looking at a map. If the map is only one shade of gray, every road looks the same. It becomes very hard to know which path to take. Emotion is the color on that map. It helps the brain recognize what is attractive, what is dangerous, what deserves attention, what should be avoided. Without emotion, all options start to look equally flat. So the real problem isn't emotion itself. The real problem is when emotion takes over at the wrong time. Emotion is very useful when it helps you detect danger, create motivation, respond quickly. But it is not well suited for major financial decisions, reacting during conflict, making long-term choices. If the brain is like a car, emotion is not the enemy. It is the engine. But the engine should not be the one holding the steering wheel. A common mistake many people make. When people realize they're prone to emotional decisions, they often try to suppress emotion, ignore emotion, act purely rational. But that approach usually doesn't last. Because emotion is not something you can switch off like a light. Emotion is a biological signal. It is more like hunger. You can ignore it for a while, but it will come back. A more realistic goal. Instead of trying to become someone with no emotions, a more realistic goal is this. Create distance between emotion and action. In simple terms, emotion can still show up, but behavior does not have to happen immediately. A small pause is sometimes enough for the rational system in the brain to catch up. Not to remove emotion, but to put it in the right place in the decision-making process. And this part matters. You do not need to become a perfect person. No one can make completely rational decisions all the time. Even very disciplined people still make emotional decisions sometimes. A more realistic goal is to reduce the frequency and the consequences of impulsive decisions. Not to optimize yourself into a machine, but to reduce risk in those moments when your brain is being pulled by emotion. And thankfully, there are a few fairly simple ways to do that. Not magic tricks. Not brain hacks. Just ways to give reason a few more seconds to show up. Once you understand this mechanism, the most practical question is usually, so what can I actually do to make fewer emotional decisions? The honest answer is, there is no way to make emotion disappear completely. But there is one very practical strategy. Create a delay between emotion and action. That delay might be 30 seconds, a few minutes, or a full day. But sometimes that alone is enough for the rational system in the brain to start working. I often think of this as giving the brain more time to load its data. Emotion runs on high-speed internet. Reason is more like a computer with too many tabs open. If you hit decide immediately, reason hasn't even finished loading. Before the decision, create a slow down rule. One of the simplest things you can do is set fixed delay rules. For example, any item above a certain price right pointing arrow wait 24 hours. Emails written while angry right pointing arrow do not send immediately. Financial decisions right pointing arrows sleep on it overnight. The mechanism behind this is pretty simple. As time passes, chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol start to drop. The emotional system becomes less dominant, and the prefrontal cortex gets a chance to process information more clearly. What's interesting is that many people try the 24-hour rule for shopping, and realize that half the things they wanted to buy suddenly no longer feel that appealing. Not because the item changed, but because the state of the brain changed. In the emotional moment, slow down the nervous system. When emotion is running high, trying to think logically usually doesn't work very well. Because at that point, the brain is in survival reaction mode. What works better is calming the nervous system first. One very simple way is to slow your breathing down. It sounds a little cliché, but the physiology behind it is quite clear. When you breathe slowly and deeply, your heart rate drops. The sympathetic nervous system becomes less active. The body shifts into a calmer state. This helps the amygdala become less noisy. And when emotional arousal decreases, reason has a chance to come back online. Not to make you perfect, just to help you avoid saying or doing things you'll regret later. After the decision, reflect instead of blaming yourself. One important thing many people overlook is this: reflection after the decision. Not to blame yourself, but to understand what emotion was driving me in that moment. Fear of missing out, wounded pride, the need to feel validated, or simply exhaustion. Recognizing your emotional patterns helps the brain learn over time. It's like updating software. The next day and in the long run, design your environment. One interesting truth is this: willpower is not the most reliable tool. Environment is often more powerful. For example, don't save your bank card on shopping apps. Don't read work emails before bed. Keep your phone away from the bed. These small changes add friction to impulsive behavior. And sometimes just a few extra steps. Give the brain enough time to calm down before acting. But it's also important to be clear about the limits. These strategies will not turn you into a person who is always rational. No one can do that. What they can do is help. Reduce how often impulsive decisions happen. Reduce the damage when emotion takes over. And sometimes, just reducing 10 to 20% of the most dangerous emotional decisions is already enough to make life a lot less messy. After understanding all of this, there's a strange feeling many people experience. It's the realization that a lot of the decisions in their lives did not come from pure reason in the way they once believed. There were times you said something because emotion had been triggered. Times you bought something because your brain was chasing a reward feeling. Times you believed something because it felt right, not necessarily because it was true. If you look back long enough, you'll start to see a pretty clear pattern. Emotion usually decides the direction. Reason usually comes later to explain it. At first, realizing this can feel a little uncomfortable, because it shakes a familiar belief that human beings are fully rational creatures. But seen from another angle, it can also help us become less harsh with ourselves. Not every bad decision comes from a lack of intelligence. Very often, it is simply biology doing exactly what it was designed to do. A system built to help our ancestors survive in dangerous environments is now trying to operate in a modern world, full of advertising, algorithms, social pressure, and complex choices. In other words, there is nothing wrong with our brains. They were just not designed for the environment we live in now. Knowledge does not make you perfect. A very common misunderstanding is this: once we understand how the brain works, we'll start making every decision rationally. In reality, that's not what happens. Understanding does not turn you into a machine. You will still buy the wrong things sometimes, say the wrong things sometimes, trust the wrong people sometimes. What changes is not that mistakes disappear. What changes is their frequency and their consequences. You start noticing sooner. Oh, emotion is driving right now. And sometimes just noticing that is enough to help you slow down for a few seconds. Those few seconds may not change your entire life, but in important moments, they may help you avoid decisions that would cost you for years. Sustainable living matters more than self-optimization. These days, there's a lot of content about self-optimization, brain hacks, becoming the best version of yourself. But from a biological perspective, a more realistic goal might be to live sustainably with the brain you actually have. Not to turn yourself into a perfect person, but to understand the mechanism, manage risk, and reduce the worst decisions. It's like driving a car. You can't control everything on the road. But if you keep your distance, slow down when needed, and pay attention at dangerous turns, the chance of a crash drops a lot. Life with a human brain is very similar. You don't need to drive perfectly. You just need fewer collisions over time. One final thought. If there's one thing worth remembering from all of this, it's probably this: emotion is not the enemy of reason. It is part of the decision-making system. The problem only appears when emotion makes the decision, and reason never gets the chance to participate. So sometimes, a small pause, a deep breath, or one night of sleep before making a decision is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign that you're giving your brain a little more time to work properly. And in many situations in life, Just that little bit of extra time is enough to help things go in a better direction. The content in this video is meant to share scientific knowledge and everyday life experience in a simple, accessible way. It is not a substitute for medical or psychological advice. If you are dealing with mental health issues, anxiety disorders, depression, or if you are taking medication related to the nervous system, please speak directly with a doctor or qualified healthcare professional for guidance that fits your situation.